Have you seen signs of chronic stress in your loved ones, but you weren't sure? Do you believe your loved one is in burnout, but you don't know what to do about it? One of the hardest things to watch is a loved one slowly pulling back from you and everything else as they continue down a spiral of burnout. Join us today as we discuss how to recognize chronic stress and burnout in your significant other and you. We'll also cover tips to help them recognize it and start to make changes. Hi, welcome to Rekindle XM, where we talk about stress, burnout, and the effective ways to recover from the ashes of burnout and rekindle our fire. I'm your host today, and with me is my lovely wife, Michelle. So, Michelle, we left our jobs, we sold our home, we went RVing full time. We had come to a point where we were both recognized we needed to make changes in our lives and decided to finally act on it. At this point, we had been married for 15 years. Did you notice signs of my burnout before we chucked it all and left?
Yes, and in fact, I think I noticed it for many years before we actually made a decision to change, because I remember even, early on in our relationship and in our marriage that you didn't particularly like your work. Like there were parts of it you liked, but it was obvious that overall this was not a career direction that you particularly enjoyed. You could do it and you were proficient, but I could always tell that there was just a lack of real passion there. So I noticed it right from the beginning. I think, though, in the years before we decided to leave, what I really noticed was there didn't seem to be a whole lot of ability to think outside the box anymore. Like, you felt trapped and you couldn't really see outside of what you were doing. I noticed too that you were withdrawing from a lot of things that you enjoyed in life. You were spending more time watching TV, more time.
One of my favorite things to do, though.
It is one of your favorite things to do, yes. But you were spending more time on that. We just weren't getting out and doing the things that we enjoyed as much, because we both enjoyed going to the mountains, getting out for a drive.
Well, let's cover this from my end too, because I'm not the only reason why that happened.
That's true. I mean, the other obvious thing was you started to drink more. It was becoming more of a pattern because you were trying to de-stress after the end of the workday, because you just didn't like it. It was a struggle to get through the workday.
So, when we were, for the last 10 years of our marriage, maybe even a little longer than that, we weren't really considering it burnout. We knew each other were stressed.
Yes.
And I saw all the amount of work that you were putting into your career. And I was constantly harping on you to make changes there, but you didn't feel like you could listen to me, or didn't want to listen to me, however you want to bring that out. And so I saw some of the same things. We both started gaining weight. We both started doing less activities. We didn't connect with our friends anymore. You still enjoyed doing Bible studies and some things like that to have a little bit of community, but we were losing community. And I have to say that we've pretty much lost the majority of our community that we used to know. There were times where you would finally just break down and let loose on me because your stress had built up and you weren't talking to me in ways that you should have been beforehand. So we both were showing major signs of chronic stress. We just didn't recognize it as burnout this time, but we also didn't really put enough thought into it to be able to help each other.
Well, but I think we were both in survival mode at that point, and you kind of get locked into what you know and what you're comfortable with. So we were going down kind of this slow decline into stress and burnout, but we just didn't recognize it.
Yeah. So as we continue to talk about flamed out and investigate in this portion of the episode, which is part of our fire system, Here are several signs that your significant other may be experiencing burnout. These were taken from an article written by Kathy Ferguson Liddon called What to Do When Your Wife is Burned Out, Warning Signs. And at Sin Network, well, it was written at Sin Network, and from an article titled Here are 5 Signs of Burnout in Your Partner, written by the therapyinbeverlyhills.com. So the list starts with they lack enthusiasm and energy for tasks and projects they once found engaging and exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I can see that in both of us. We used to love to get out, go to the mountains, hike, ride motorcycles, all of that. And we were just slowly, that was decreasing over time.
Yes, it was. You got to the point where you weren't really walking as much as you used to, too. So yes, we both definitely saw that in each other. So the next point, they are withdrawn and isolated from people and events.
Yeah, and I think, we both still had people we connected with, but we were no longer involved in like larger community and friend groups. So much of our time was just spent coming and going from work. And so it felt like that circle of friends was shrinking and we didn't really have a sense of community anymore.
That was true in the last, how long were we in that house? 7 years? Certainly when we moved into the new house. When we lived in the old house, we still had some community. But it's like we voluntarily decided to leave that community when we left to the other house. Part of our issue is we lived on the north side of town, and eventually our work was on the south side of town, which makes for a bad decision because they always say either live close to your church or to where you work, or something like that. Anyway, so yes, as we were doing that, we would leave at 6:30 in the morning, if not sooner, get to work about 7:30, 8, because it would take a while. Leave at 4:35. We would never cook at home because it took too long. So we never had any time. By the time we got home, we didn't want to do anything else because we were tired because we were gone for 12, 14 hours of the day. So it's hard to have a life when you spend most of your life between commuting and working. So,
Right. Yeah, and that's I think that's part of it in our modern culture is, we do often have these long commutes if you live anywhere near a big city, and you don't think about that as you're switching jobs or switching houses. And then it just kind of adds up because we were in this cycle of during the week, it was just work, relax for a couple hours at night, go to bed, do the same thing the next day. And then you get to the weekend and you have all your house chores. And we had 2 acres and a large house.
yeah, but the 2 acres really only came into effect in the summertime, and that was mostly May and June before the Denver summer killed everything off.
Right.
So the third point is they are lonely. And I'm kind of introverted anyway, so I didn't show that as much. But you constantly were talking about how you wanted to have community. So the fifth point is they are brittle.
Yeah, and I guess to me what that means is they're easily triggered.
Yes.
That's how I would describe that. And I would say that was true of both of us for different reasons, but we were easily triggered and we would get angry, frustrated quickly.
Yes, by the time we left, all it took was one instance to make me mad enough to want to drink the night away.
Mm-hmm.
So, guess I didn't notice that in you as much.
Right, but I would say that I got easily frustrated with the time that task took, or trying to keep up with housework, or trying to get ready to go over and visit people. I would get easily frustrated with the time it was taking because I felt like I didn't have any time.
True. And we actually had a maid service to do our bottom floor, and that still didn't seem to matter to you.
Oh, it helped. But I would say that it was like, trying to bail out a ship with a thimble. So it helped a little bit, but in the overall scheme of things, it just felt like there was constantly not enough time and for me to do the things you enjoy, to have those relationships outside of the home. It just felt like time was the constant battle that we were fighting, at least on my end.
Yeah, I won't disagree. I've always had a different view of time management than you, and you've always had more anxiety and gotten worked up more when things weren't going how you thought they should.
Which just it's interesting. So, I love research, so I have to go out and read the research. And my reaction as a woman is pretty typical. Women tend to react more on the emotional side. You see a lot of frustration and anxiety and this, like, I'm overwhelmed. Whereas men tend to be more withdrawn, go into their own world, be into, TV, video games, something along those lines that will distract them. So it's kind of a typical response that we had.
So the sixth sign is they are growing increasingly cynical.
Right. My life is bad. It's always going to be bad. I can't do anything about it. Yeah.
And I tend to be a pessimistic person anyway, so I've always kind of had a negative attitude. Glass is half full. And so that was definitely true for me. You've always been more of a positive person. You don't think the glass is half full. You don't always think it's half empty, but you tend to see things in a better perspective than I do, which helps at times, but is also very annoying at times.
Sure. Especially to someone who doesn't know, because I would be like, well, why don't you just go find something different to do? Find a different job if you hate your job. And you were like, that is not helpful because I can't even think of anything. So yeah, I didn't help in that situation.
Well, you helped in making me realize that I needed to make a change because I was really stuck in the idea that I found my career. I just need to stick with it because that's what people do. And that's totally a boomer philosophy, and we're Gen Xers, so we don't necessarily need to follow that philosophy. But when you have that mindset, it's hard to get past it. And I also used to use Ecclesiastes, be content wherever you are in life. And I wasn't showing my contentment if I wasn't content in my job, even though the job was pushing me towards a very bad end.
Mm-hmm.
So, the seventh point, they are battling physical fatigue and sleep won't remedy. This is very true on my part. I was always tired.
Yes. And I definitely noticed that. And of course, I'm one of those, at least, especially early on in our marriage. I was like, oh, let's go do this. Let's go do that. And you're like, no, too tired. But my energy also went down over time.
It did. You were easier to convince to do nothing.
Yep.
Point 8, they seem to have growing irritation, cynicism, and pessimism. Guess we already covered that.
Yes. And that was definitely true.
But as far as the growing irritation, I think the further you get into stress and the more chronic it becomes and the more burnout it is, the more irritated and angry people tend to be. And this isn't just in burnout. I mean, this is in anxiety and depression as well. So those are definitely signs to look at. If the person is always irritated, cynical, and just angry overall, then there's probably a lot of underlying issues that they're not dealing with.
Right. And I think, now that we've researched the science behind it, you kind of realize what's happening, because when you have those stress chemicals, so cortisol, adrenaline, that are constantly in your system, that means your system is constantly ready for like this fight or flight response. So of course you're going to be more irritable. You're going to be set off easily by just smaller things.
So number 9, they are experiencing stress-related illness, such as migraines or digestive stress. So to speak on my wife's behalf, she has been stuck on omeprazole for 10 years or more now. She has almost lost her gallbladder. She probably should have had it taken out, but she fought through it and it came back to life.
Yeah, and I think, we all know what stress feels like to some extent, but we don't recognize the physical signs. And I kind of knew I was stressed. I figured that, the constant feeling of, acidity in your stomach, I figured it was related to stress in some way, but I didn't realize how closely connected to stress that is. And the same thing with migraine headaches, the same thing with musculoskeletal, like, especially in this area, one of our good friends and our partner, in fact, that's where she carries her stress. And we just don't put those things together that, oh, this is an indication of burnout and this long-term ongoing stress.
It is. My first ulcer was at 17. And I actually lost my gallbladder at 28. And I don't know that I could say I was having major chronic stress, but I can say that I was definitely in some level of burnout, because that was probably 8 years into a job that I hated and struggled with. All right. Number 10, they display spiritual distance, a cold relationship with God, or a lack of desire to pray or read scripture.
Yeah, we actually both struggle with this for a good part of our marriage. And I think that it is true when you are in this kind of severe distress or apathy with work and with life, you also tend to have that cool relationship with, the spiritual sense. And I noticed it in you. You actually had a burnout experience related to leading a Bible study, and you actually got burned out in that, which I think people don't realize that it's possible to get burned out in ministry, but oh yeah, absolutely is. And in fact, full-time.
Well, you think of that as pastors, not people leading Bible studies. But we had just come off a stressful time because we had just gotten married, and we had to start new Bible studies because the Bible study we both were attending didn't allow people to be married and attend. It was for singles only. So I didn't actually want to lead that Bible study, but the person who was in charge of the overall study put a good guilt trip on me, and I ended up doing it, and I pretty much crashed and burned that year.
Yeah, well, and part of that was you had your meetings at 5:30 a.m. on Friday morning. So at the end of a work week where you already, hated work, and then you were already exhausted, and then getting up at 4:30 in the morning to get to these meetings. I think that was part of it because you were already tired. So this just added to exhaustion.
It did, but we were also staying active at that time. So I was biking to work, and that was 10, 15 miles.
Yep.
So it wasn't fully burnout, but it was needing a break, and I didn't set my boundaries.
Right. And
at this point, I know how to set my boundaries. So that was from Kathy Ferguson Litton's What to Do When Your Wife is Burned Out, Warning Signs. So the therapybeverlyhills.com has 5 signs of burnout, and you'll notice that they overlap over the 10 that she gave. The 10 that she gave were broken down more. So the first one is they distance themselves from you. The second one is they are losing interest in hobbies, and we both commented on that. They are avoidant of work, and that is very true. I never had any vacation. Vacation I had. Yeah.
As soon as you got it.
Constant negativity and excessive use of alcohols and drugs.
And I think to add to that, probably any addictive behavior, because not everyone turns to alcohol and drugs.
True. So Michelle's going to take over from here.
So then the question is, what do you do if you see your spouse in burnout? So I pulled this from connectcouplestherapy.com. And there's 5 ways that you can help your spouse or partner if you think they're suffering from burnout. So the first is encouraging self-care. So encouraging healthy coping methods. Whatever your spouse or partner, whatever they find enjoyable or helps them reduce stress, like for you, going for drives up in the mountains particularly, encourage that. So as much as possible, helping them go do what will help them. So did we do this? Do you feel like we tried to do this?
We did, but the problem is where we moved to is farther from both of our ideal areas of supportive coping.
Yes.
Because it took an hour to get to the mountains, and so we just kind of stopped going. So I don't really like healthy as a term. I like helpful, because what's healthy is not always helpful.
True.
So it's kind of semantics, but to me it's an important semantics, because for some people running is really healthy and it's helpful. I will never voluntarily jog a day in my life because it is more stressful and not enjoyable to me. So that's kind of the difference between healthy and unhealthy and helpful for me. So I was just kind of pointing that out.
Yeah.
But the other thing is even though we give you these tips on how to encourage and get your significant other or just somebody that you care about and see this happening to, is they have to be willing to acknowledge it. You can do whatever you want, but if they're not willing to acknowledge it, they're not going to make any changes. So you need to find the encouraging ways to help them in the areas that you can, but you also have to get them to realize and see it.
Yes. And actually, I'm going to jump down to the third of these. We'll go back. So one of those is facilitating open communication and being non-judgmental. So we actually had talked about this, and we were both well aware you didn't like your job, and we were talking about it. You were thinking about it. So what's hard though is you're correct too, though, that the person has to be ready to change. So keep the lines of communication open, but recognize until that person is ready to change, they may not take those steps. So being non-judgmental, being patient, even as you're keeping those lines of communication open.
Yes, and trying to create an atmosphere where they're willing to open up, because by the time they've hit a certain point of burnout, it's going to be harder for them to open.
Yeah. So the second one actually is provide practical support, which is assisting your partner, your spouse, with household chores or other things that could be adding stress outside of work. But I would say one of the things you did for me was you took the pressure off of cooking, because after a long day of work, when we were, maybe not the most healthy solution to stop and get dinner, but I will say I appreciated the fact that you were always willing to be like, okay, you don't have to cook. Let's just grab something on the way home.
Well, that wasn't a matter of supporting you.
It worked for both of us.
Yes. It was a matter of I didn't want to take the time to go home and wait, even though it takes the same amount of time to sit in a restaurant and wait for your food to come as it does to cook at home most of the time. I just didn't want to wait.
Right.
So, how can you be supportive when you both are in burnout and you're not really recognizing it?
I think that's a harder situation because we were both there.
Yes.
So when you're both there, that means that you as the partner, you may not recognize what you can do to practically help the other person. And frankly, you're tired, you're exhausted, and you don't want to. I would say that once we recognized we were in burnout and we reached a decision about our next few steps, that we started working together and helping each other. Like, we knew what we had to do. We had to get the house done. There were certain things we had to do to be able to sell. And we just started working together towards that. And that was actually really good for us, even though we were, out every day working on that deck for what felt like months. It was months, but we were helping each other get to that point where we could step away.
Yeah, and I guess that's one sign too to look out for is, we constantly were talking about leaving Denver,
Mm-hmm.
and it had been an ongoing conversation for 10 years, and it would go away for a few years and then it'd come up again. I think we both knew we needed out of an environment, even though our family was holding us there and we didn't want to leave our family. I think we realized that we needed change, but we weren't fully recognizing it.
Yeah, and I think as couples, as families, we just get stuck in the environment that we're in, even if we know it's perhaps not the best for us. It's still hard to actually say, no, it's time for change. So here's the fourth one: offer emotional support. And I think I was not good at this, especially early on, because when I saw you didn't like your job, and I did see that it was stressing you out, but I would come to you and be like, well, go find something else to do. And as it turns out, that was probably the complete wrong way to approach it, because I have a feeling that probably just added to your frustration, because you're like, I can't think of anything else to do.
Well, I had ideas, but because I took classes in photography, I thought about going into that. I took classes in, I was starting to look at web design. But the amount of time it would take me to change and the desire not to have to start at a significantly lower income stopped me from doing it. So in some ways it was that toxic security, knowing that if I went back to school and finished my engineering degree, I would start out at almost the same income that I left. And that was hard for me to give up. Plus, I don't like to quit things. So when I quit engineering and went to CAD school, that was a kind of a blow that I wasn't fully recognizing. I recognized it, but getting my engineering degree closed that cycle.
Mm-hmm.
It was a right choice in some ways, and it was an overall wrong choice in others. So you just sometimes don't know until you start making those changes.
Right. Which is why it's important to support your spouse or partner, because they may not know, especially as you start to take steps, they may not know what they're moving towards. They know what they want to move away from.
But you were very supportive,
yeah.
Because
I think I learned over time. I think I learned it wasn't helpful to just say, hey, go do something else.
Well, what you did is you made me realize how much I needed out of what I was doing. And yes, that caused more frustration to me. I used to joke to my friends, don't let Michelle tell you about finding purpose because she'll ruin your life. But you were supportive in the fact that you allowed me to go back to school full time and I didn't have to work. So you can't take that away. It's not like you were not, because that's as much emotional support as it is physical support.
Yeah, and I would say, like, you recognized and started opening those lines of communication for me around work, because I was one of those who thought I had to do everything myself. I was willing to put in the long hours of work, but over time, you just kind of slowly started saying, well, it's not all on you. You're not totally responsible. You don't have to feel like you don't have to work 60 hours a week. So you started opening my eyes to some beliefs that I had. So I think we were trying to support each other, but again, it's just hard because you don't always know what to do. And sometimes it was just patience.
It was, and honestly, when I first started in my career, I was kind of the same way. Overtime didn't bother me. But I learned within the first 5 years that companies will use you for that overtime and you don't benefit from it. And so I grew a little bit cynical there, but I also saw that in you, but you never had an opportunity where your work treated you in that way to make you be realize that there's no, sometimes you need to do it, sometimes you want to do it, but you don't always have to do it.
Yeah.
And yes, you had a hard time listening to me because by the time I was talking to you, I was burned out. I wasn't engaged at work as much as I should be. And I think that led you to misbeliefs in my work ethic and other things.
But I did actually hear you, and I actually think this is an important point about keeping those communication lines open. And the emotional support is sometimes your spouse, they won't act like they hear you. They will act like they're ignoring you. But sometimes we just don't want to admit that our spouse is right. I did hear you. And I think over time, I started to hear that and I started to recognize that.
True.
So,
You did.
so let's move on to the fifth tip, which is assist your partner with finding professional help. We didn't choose to go this route, but we've talked to other people. In fact, I love the story. We interviewed one of our friends, Stephen, and his wife was a nurse, and he went through a particularly difficult time with family and burnt out. And his wife actually just scheduled the appointments for him and said, just give it a try. Go once. Just go once. He did. And it turned out that was tremendously helpful. So it does depend on the openness of your spouse. Like, I don't think that approach would have worked with you.
No, I probably would not have went regardless of how much you pushed.
Right.
So
know your spouse and know how to suggest it, but don't push it if they're not willing.
yes, because that can add another layer of stress. I mean, the situation never came up, so I can't say that I absolutely wouldn't have listened, but it would have been a source of contention. And it was for Stephen. He talks about in the episode where we interviewed him how he's a Black Jamaican and they don't do therapy. And I think most men feel that way.
Yeah.
It is very hard for a man to want to do therapy.
It is. So what about, my kind of last thought with this is, what can you do yourself? Because sometimes your spouse isn't ready. Obviously, you want to do those other 5 things. You want to encourage them to be self-care. You want to facilitate the open communication. You want to be supportive, provide practical support when you can. But then what about on your end? So if your spouse isn't yet ready to make a huge change, these are kind of my thoughts. But one of the things that is important is keeping yourself as healthy as possible. So trying, if you can, to stay, as balanced and as emotionally strong as you can. I think we were both in that situation of burnout, so we were each trying to deal with it on our own. So I don't know, in our case, like, we were trying to do what we could. I don't know if we were able to help each other because of where we were in burnout.
I think we each had our times where we would talk to the other. It looked different because you would reach a point where you would break down and I would have to talk you down. But I don't ever, you can't talk me down. So the times we had that conversation is when I was reflective on myself and
Right.
just needed to talk. So being willing to listen to a guy who's willing to break down what's going on with him is very important because that's a high level of trust.
It is. Yeah.
For men.
And I would say, actually, that was one of the tips I thought about, is be ready when your partner is wanting to make a change, or when they get to that point. Because usually what will happen, and everybody we've talked to who's been burnt out, eventually you reach some kind of crisis and there's going to have to be a change. So I would say, if you know your partner's stressed and probably headed for burnout, just be ready. Be emotionally prepared as you can be, because it's likely that something is going to need to change. In some cases, people have ended up in the hospitals. They're out on medical leave. Then you have all those practical considerations of, okay, probably not bringing as much money in. They may need a complete break. Like you needed a complete break. So I think one of the things I did years ahead of time was I was emotionally ready for that. I knew it was coming. And I'm like, okay, there's going to be a point at which I may need to support us. Brian may need to take a break. He may need to switch. Our finances may not be the same. So I was at that point where I was like, okay, I'm ready. Whatever's going to happen, at some point, we're going to have to change. So be ready.
Yes, I think that's a good point. I don't really have anything to add on that.
Yeah. And I would say that here's one that I didn't see come up anywhere, and I don't know why, but finances are incredibly stressful.
Yeah.
So if your spouse is in burnout, trying to consider ways to help with that. And I'll go back to the story of this has actually happened multiple times in history where, generally the wife in this case, they've set aside a little bit of money. They've had a nest egg. And when something happened with their spouse, they're like, okay, great. Now go do what you're supposed to do. And I have this money set aside. So what I'm saying is, as much as possible, if you don't have a budget, get a budget, know what you actually have to live. Start saving if you can. Start looking for ways to take some of the financial stress off. Because if you have, 3 to 6 months saving, or like us, if you have enough to actually know that you are financially secure for a year while your partner, spouse figures it out, that takes a lot of stress off.
It does.
So that takes some planning. It's not like it's not something that happens necessarily quickly or easily, but if there is any way to reduce some financial stress, that may help your partner, particularly if they're in your situation and they need to switch careers.
Yes, having excessive debt is going to wear on both people a lot, and it's going to be hard to. It's just one more thing on your shoulders.
Right. Yeah.
And when we were first married, I brought a lot of that into there, and I finally.
Yeah, I married into debt.
You did marry into debt. Michelle was debt free, and she still married me. What a. She wasn't thinking that one through. But we finally got to a point where when I was ready to make changes there, and we found a system that worked. It wasn't the best system, but it certainly helped because we still had debt. We didn't really have a lot of savings, but the debt was house debt, and it wasn't really like credit card or other debt.
Right.
So that makes a big difference, and it allowed Michelle to do the support that she's talking about. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to go to school full time and focus solely on getting through there as quickly as I could. So what else do you?
I guess the one other thing that I've been thinking about is, we took a week and it was kind of our own couples retreat. So when we realized where we were at and we both recognized that we had to make a change, we set aside time in a relaxing environment, which for us was the mountains. And we set aside a whole week just to go and dream together. And I think that maybe that's something that couples should be doing on a regular basis is, a restful time away from your normal routine where you can reconnect and where you can look towards the future and be like, well, do we want to keep doing what we're doing? And we already knew that no, we don't. Mm-hmm. But we needed that time away together to come up with our first few steps.
Yes. And that made a big difference. It gave us both renewed energy to be able to realize that there was an endpoint coming, and we just had to push to get that done. And that, I think, probably what got us both there to the end. If we had decided not to do anything, well, one, we wouldn't be doing this podcast, but two, who knows what would have happened to me.
Right. Yeah. And then on the flip side of that, now that we're almost 2.5 years since we left, since we sold everything, started a brand new lifestyle, we've reconnected as a couple. Our communication is better. our relationship is better. We still have stress because that doesn't totally go away, but making
Especially
that
in 300
change.
square feet.
Yeah, exactly. But making that change, even though life is never perfect because there's always something, but I don't regret it. It was the right choice for us.
It was. Want to close this out?
Sure. I guess I would say is, it's really hard, especially when someone you love is going through this extensive stress and burnout. But it is possible to help each other. And it is possible, eventually the change is going to come one way or another. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's not the change you want, but change is going to come. So be ready for it and just recognize that there is a whole lot of great things on the other side of it.
Yes. So if you've liked what we've said today, please like and subscribe or follow us on one of our social media forums. Again, today we covered how to recognize burnout in your significant other. This was part of our FIRE system. We went over flamed out and then investigate, and we talked some about rekindle. So,
And if you want to know more, we do have a book coming out that gives our experiences as well as the experience of our partners. So 3 people who went through burnout and recovered and have gone on to now find renewed purpose and just a new joy in life.
we'll see you next week.